spiritual home in Unitarian Universalism. It happened early on in my year as a ministerial intern there at FUN in fall of 2019. Reverend Gale had invited me to attend the Worship Planning Committee monthly meeting as part of my learning, and we were all seated in a circle around the large table in the fireside room. The team was discussing the upcoming monthly worship themes, one of which was God. One of the worship associates immediately, directly, and rather casually initiated conversation about the benefits and challenges of using the word God in our congregation. Others chimed in, including Reverend Gale, and suddenly we were in a full-fledged discussion about whether or not to use God language in church, with voices noting how it might bring up traumatic feelings for some, and others, it might feel accessible for them. I especially remember when Elaine Bailey, whose permission I have to share this story, shared how she was raised Southern Baptist, and how the word God for her was really difficult because it reminded her of the fire and brimstone parts of her theological upbringing, and how she loved certain parts of her childhood religion and sometimes missed the Bible stories, but how to this day the word God made her feel a little afraid, even though she had left that church 20 years ago. I think I can still see and hear Elaine sharing this so clearly in my memory because at the time I most resonated with her perspective. I remember sitting there feeling a sense of awe that I got to be at a church where we were discussing whether or not and how often and why or why not to use God language in a worship meeting. It was just so raw and honest and felt so true to my own experience. And I remember sitting there smiling, my heart feeling full and thinking, wow, I guess I belong here. The work of feminist theologian Mary McClintock Fulkerson explores how theology begins at the site of a wound. She says, like a wound, theological thinking is generated by a sometimes inchoate sense that something must be addressed. So if theology, as Merriam-Webster defines it, is the study of religious faith, practice, and experience, especially the study of God and of God's relation to the world, then what does it mean when one feels that God is the wound, or that theology is the wound? How does a person or a group of people do theology then? By the way, I must say I love how Lisa's stewardship moment is going to connect to this sermon. So in my personal theology and our shared UU theology, doing theology includes and even centers experience. As we put it, UUism is a living tradition that affirms and promotes direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. That is one of our 6 sources, as many of you know well. So allow me to share some of my spiritual and religious experience with all of you this morning as a way of doing theology together. As I've shared a few years ago, I grew up in the Christian Reformed Church, which is a small Calvinist denomination founded by Dutch immigrants. For those who this resonates, our closest Protestant cousins are the Presbyterians. My father is and was, during my childhood, a pastor, and my mother was a teacher at the Christian school that we all attended until also entering full-time ministry. So I was a pastor's kid. You might have heard of us. Our reputation precedes us for good and bad. Well, I was a very good Christian girl, involved in Sunday school, choir, taking notes during my dad's sermons and talking to him about it afterward, following all the rules of the community about modesty and purity. And as a high schooler, I even joined the chapel worship planning team and co-founded a girls' Bible study with my best friend because we believed that girls should be able to study the Bible themselves. I thought I would become a minister. So outwardly, I was excelling at the role of Christian young woman as I was taught to play it, but inwardly, I was suffering a great deal. You see, shortly after our family moved from Northern Virginia to Michigan, in the middle of my freshman year of high school, I began struggling with my body image and developed an eating disorder that lasted about 5 years, although it was never diagnosed. Whenever my very concerned parents or aunts would ask me if I was losing weight or not eating enough, I would simply lie and say I was fine and insist that they left me alone. You can imagine, being a teenager. So patterns of restrictive eating and over-exercising became interspersed with bouts of binging and purging, all of which were accompanied by cycles of guilt and shame. One of my prayer journals from February 12, 2003 reads, "Lord, I'm sorry about this body and weight issue. I know it is wrong and I should be content and even proud of what I look like no matter what because you have created me. Yet I struggle with not wanting to lose or gain weight, but to stay like I am. But then I watch what I eat and feel guilty for eating too much, and it shouldn't matter because what is inside matters, but it does. So forgive me of that and my other sins." I believed that if my faith was good enough, I would not be struggling. And this was my ultimate source of shame. This story illuminates my young-lived Christian Reformed beliefs about sin and salvation. As evidenced by my prayer, I conceived of sin as my unhealthy personal choices and lack of contentment. I beseeched God for salvation, which I imagined as deliverance from my bad feelings. Simply stated, I was taught to believe that Jesus was sent to earth by God to die on the cross as a ransom for my personal sins and other people who were elected's personal sins, so that we could all access individual salvation. I often felt pushed and pulled by a theological tension that I could not make sense of no matter how hard I tried. On the one end of that tension was my belief that I was saved by grace alone. It was a free gift from God. But on the other end of that tension was my belief that I was born a sinner, innately flawed and completely reliant on God's grace to do good. The latter manifested in my brain and body as an acute sense that I was not good simply by being a human being, which translated into a subconscious belief that I was bad unless I was doing good. In other words, it was like existing in a chronic state of shame. Moreover, sometimes it felt like all the doing right and not doing wrong was necessary for my salvation, which was supposed to be free. So this was very confusing. When I got to college and learned about corporate or collective sin, as in societal injustices like white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism, colonization, genocide, I was at the very least confused, and moreover, I was hurt and betrayed by all the ways in which my beloved religion of Christianity was culpable in these many systems of power and privilege and violence. I was full of grief and anger, and I just didn't have the tools to process it. This was towards the church at large and toward those who neglected to teach me about this horrific shadow side of our faith, and also toward God. By the end of my sophomore year of college, I declared to my parents and close friends tearfully that I was not a Christian anymore. Spoiler alert for anyone who missed this, the sermon title is entitled, "Why I'm a Christian, Pagan, Unitarian Universalist." over 15 years later, I can look back and recognize that this decision was way more emotionally driven than intellectually driven, but at the time I thought the opposite. I mostly found myself explaining to family and friends that I just wasn't sure Jesus was the Son of God anymore, so how could I call myself a Christian? Well, now I know that's called being a Unitarian. But the truth is that I felt emotionally and spiritually exhausted from trying to climb this pyramid of perfection where God was sitting at the top. And I just didn't know how to be a Christian without being stuck in these cycles of guilt and shame and bodily harm. So I left my faith at the time, and as I said, this caused me great pain, and I grieved this decision. I like to say that then community organizing became my church. But into my late 20s, after several years of doing a lot of organizing and activism, I kept feeling burnt out. And I was fortunate enough to have several elders and wise leaders in the communities I was a part of around me to help me awaken to the fact that this burnout might be related to the truth that I was a spiritual being without a spirituality. So I was already very active outdoors with friends and nourished by my time in the forest and water and sunshine. And gradually I began to return home to my spirituality through earth-based practices that friends introduced me to, such as working with an altar, moon rituals, astrology, tarot, and celebrating the Celtic pagan holidays that mark the changes of the seasons, such as winter solstice and spring equinox, which, as Wesley mentioned, is tomorrow. These pagan practices, as well as divine feminine archetypes, became a way to more deeply heal my body and to practice being in right relationship to all living things. Coming home to the knowledge that my body and our whole species are part of nature, not separate from nature. And then in 2016, when I was at the Standing Rock encampment where the Standing Rock Sioux Nation was resisting the Dakota Access Pipeline, I met a Unitarian Universalist minister who just happened to be the senior minister of a church in Virginia, which is where I was about to move in a week. So when I moved to Virginia from Minnesota, I started going to that UU church. And long story short, that's when I realized I still wanted to be, and maybe could be, a minister. So I decided to go to divinity school, and in one of my divinity school notebooks, which for most of you know, that was at Vanderbilt, that's what brought me to Nashville. So in one of my divinity school notebooks, very on, I wrote the words, "I came to heal." It was very clear to me in my heart that I went to divinity school partly to heal my own relationship to Christianity and God, whatever that meant to me at the time. But if you haven't heard, academia is really centered in the head and not always so great about the heart stuff. So while I had many healing experiences during my time in graduate school, let's just say that I don't feel like I made that much forward movement in my spiritual journey. As some of you know, I became a chaplain in the summer of 2021, still in Nashville, and then that August I moved here to the state of Washington for a year-long chaplain residency program. I now work full-time as a staff chaplain at a cancer center. So with this perspective, I like to say that divinity school was the theory part for me of what religion and faith is all about, and being a chaplain feels like the practice part. Like, do you really believe in love and compassion? Because here are some people for you to show love and compassion to. And they might rub you the wrong way, or remind you randomly of your grandmother, or who knows. But still, here's an opportunity to actually practice love and compassion. There were a few pivotal moments in my chaplain training that propelled my spiritual journey forward, and I want to tell you about one in particular. I went to visit a patient in the pre-surgery area, and when I walked in, I said, "My name's Elisabeth, and I'm with the spiritual care department." And he said, "Spiritual? What do you mean?" And I completely ignored the skepticism I was experiencing on his face and his tone, and I just said to myself, "Oh, he didn't hear me correctly." So I said, "Spiritual care department." And he said, "I asked for a Christian chaplain to pray with me. Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Well, I'm a Unitarian Universalist." And he responded, "What does that mean?" And I said something vague like, "Well, it's a historically Christian denomination, but more based on principles now." And he replied, "Can I have a Christian chaplain?" And I said, "I will go get you a Christian chaplain." And I walked out with my figurative tail between my legs and found one of my colleagues and said, "This patient needs your service." Now, what you need to know is that chaplains are professionally trained to serve people of all faiths or no faith. So the point of this story is not whether or not this man needed a Christian chaplain. If I had had a genuine visit with him and assessed that I was not the right chaplain to meet his needs and went and got another chaplain, that would have been a totally fine visit. But that's not what happened. Instead, I completely lost my footing and sense of spiritual authority and did not even do my job because I became so decentered by his question of whether I was a Christian. And this didn't just happen once, it happened a handful of times during my first 6 months as a chaplain. I understood even then that my reactions were a type of trauma response and that it would keep happening if I did not work more on healing my wounds. It was shortly after this encounter that my supervisor said to us in class during a discussion, "If you love your patients, you will work on your theology." And I did. I loved my patients, so I worked on my theology. And as I did so, I came to recognize that I still deeply, fully, in my body and in my bones, do experience the divine in the Christ story. In the theology section of the Widening the Circle report written by the Commission on Institutional Change for the UUA that you all are going through this year, Reverend Dr. Elias Ortega reminds us that the word religion comes from the same base as the root word for ligament, something that binds together. He says, to be religious is to be clear about what you are bound to in a way that a ligament holds muscle to the bone. So I used to say things like, "I'm culturally Christian and religiously you." But what being a chaplain and practicing living my theology on a day-to-day level has helped me realize is that I am bound not only to my Christian heritage and culture, but also to Christian theology and spirituality. I need them for my spiritual life to feel complete and full and to make sense. So I am done compartmentalizing myself. I quit trying to stay in my head at the expense of my heart and my body. And this is why I can proclaim here my faith in our covenantal community that I am a Christian Pagan Unitarian Universalist. As the young people like to say, if you know, you know. And if you don't, that's okay too. In many ways, this service is a celebration of multi-religious identity because I don't expect any of you to be a Christian Pagan Unitarian Universalist. And that speaks to so much of what it means to be a covenantal community as a UU. and to affirm and promote each of our direct experience of the transcendent or the sacred. If we had a little more time, I would do an activity with you where I'd invite you to raise your hands if you identify with certain religious categories so that we can see who's in the room, both literally and virtually. But instead of going into the activity, I'll just invite you to maybe have conversations with each other today during social hour or moving forward about the ways in which you might hold multi-religious identities and what that means to you, because it's probably going to be different for each of us. So perhaps some of you are you and Christian, or you're maybe you and you're Jewish, or you're Muslim and you, and sometimes you practice Buddhism. I don't know. But I encourage you to have those conversations. Some of the good news, which is what the word gospel means after all, of our UU faith is that each of us in our multi-religious identities can belong under this umbrella of Unitarian Universalism. And yet, I think the shadow side of our very big umbrella is that sometimes we're like me, trying to compartmentalize ourselves, or perhaps even hiding parts of ourselves, even from ourselves, or maybe checking parts of our theology at the door. I wonder how often we say we love and embrace diversity while forgetting that diversity comes from the root word to divide, and is in fact much more about difference than it is sameness. So I'd like to move toward closing by returning to our readings from the Christian Bible and to invite you to experience what these verses might have to teach us about ourselves. In the first reading from Genesis, we learn about how Adam, human, has one of his ribs taken out and essentially broken in order to make another human. I was reminded by my former chaplain supervisor, who is herself an Episcopalian priest, of one beautiful theological interpretation of this story, namely that diversity, or dividing into two from one, is very painful and also very life-giving, which is another way of exploring how relationship comes from brokenness or from division. If we were all one, there would be no diversity. There would be no relationship. The second text we read was John chapter 4, which begins, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." For me, this is the simplest summary of the incarnation. When I allow myself to be transformed by an experience of this God who became flesh, became human, I can pray a new prayer like this over the intercom at the hospital while working as a chaplain on Good Friday. Dear God, on this Good Friday, we reflect on how Jesus was betrayed by his friends and crucified. We remember that you know what it's like to be human, to suffer, to experience state-sanctioned violence at the hands of other human beings, and to die. We take this moment to sit with our own suffering and grief, or with others and theirs, and to remember that we are not alone, O God, but that you became flesh and are with us in our suffering. Amen. Note how different a theology of incarnation this is when we compare this prayer with my prayer from high school in the midst of my own suffering from a patriarchal capitalist system that told me what beauty was supposed to look like. My prayer as a youth was a prayer about me striving to go up, to reach perfection, to be like God. But the other prayer is a prayer that centers on how God reaches down, how God made God's self a human to know what it was like to suffer, to be betrayed, to be tempted, and even to die. This is what the incarnation teaches me. As Eugene Peterson translates John 1:14 in the Message version, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. And as Reverend Rachel puts it in our opening words, I believe in the Church of Everyday Saints, as numerous, creative, and resilient as patches on the AIDS quilt, whose feet are grounded in mud, and whose eyes gaze at the stars in wonder. You know, I wonder if the Holy Trinity has a lot to teach us Unitarians about truly loving diversity and being Christ to one another, but we can save that for another sermon. Let us be together in a moment of silence.
Thank you, Elisabeth. As we move into our closing song, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit as we sing together hymn number 112 in your gray hymnal, Do You Hear?